Okay, so you want to own a nuclear power plant, find a reactor, hook it up to the grid, sell electricity to homes and businesses, and collect a check every month for the next 60 years. That's the pitch. It sounds like the most stable business on the planet. You're selling something every single person on the grid needs, every hour of every day, and almost nobody else on Earth is allowed to build what you have. Here's the part nobody tells you. The single most valuable nuclear reactor in America right now produces zero electricity. It has been sitting dark since 2019, and a company has already agreed to buy every electron it will ever make for the next 20 years before the plant has even been switched back on. That reactor is Unit 1 at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. It shut down in 2019 because, in plain terms, it couldn't make money. Cheap natural gas had pushed the wholesale price of electricity so low that an aging nuclear plant wasn't worth running. Constellation Energy, the company that owns it, is now spending $1.6 billion to bring that exact same reactor back from the dead because Microsoft signed a 20-year contract to buy its entire output at somewhere around $110 to $115 for every megawatt hour it produces, roughly 3 times what that same electricity was selling for on the open market. The plant went dark. Same reactor, same fuel rods, same location. The only thing that changed is who's buying the power and why. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the fuel here is almost free, why the insurance policy is technically a group project with 94 other reactors, why building one of these from scratch nearly bankrupted a Fortune 500 utility, and why a company will now pay you triple the going rate for electricity from a plant everyone had already written off. Let's start with what it costs to get in, because right now there are really only 2 doors. One of them is basically bolted shut. Door 1 is building a new plant from scratch. Georgia Power tried this at Plant Vaughtal, adding 2 new reactors to an existing site starting in 2009. The estimate at the time was $14 billion. The final bill, when the second reactor finally came online in 2024, was $36.8 billion for roughly 2,200 megawatts of new capacity. That works out to somewhere north of $16,000 for every kilowatt of capacity compared to $1,000 to $1,500 per kilowatt for a wind or solar farm. It took 15 years from groundbreaking to full commercial power, during which the plant generated exactly nothing. Georgia Power's own contractor, Westinghouse, went bankrupt in the middle of construction. Nobody has broken ground on a new large reactor in the United States since. That's door 1. Technically open, practically closed to anyone without a state-regulated monopoly and a government loan guarantee behind them. Door 2 is buying a plant that already exists, ideally one that's been shut down, and restarting it. This is suddenly the most competitive real estate market in American energy. Besides 3 Mile Island, a company called Holtec bought the Palisades plant in Michigan after it shut down in 2022 and is trying to restart it with a $1.52 billion loan from the Department of Energy and a $300 million grant from the state. The entry price for an existing licensed, already built reactor is a small fraction of building one new, because the concrete, the containment building, and the cooling systems are already sitting there. You're not paying for construction, you're paying to wake something up. And here's what makes an existing reactor an even stranger asset than it first appears. A nuclear plant's operating license is originally issued for 40 years, but the federal government routinely renews it for another 20, and increasingly another 20 after that. Plants built during the Nixon administration are now licensed to run past 2050, and in some cases past 2060. You're not buying a business with a normal shelf life. You're buying something closer to a piece of real estate with an 80-year lease already halfway approved, which is exactly why a plant that looked worthless in 2019 looks like the deal of the decade in 2026. Nothing about the physical asset changed. The paperwork just caught up to how long these things are actually built to last. Now we get to the question that actually matters. Where does the money come from? Not from selling electricity to your neighbors at the going rate. That's the trap door that closes on plants like 3 Mile Island in the first place. For decades, nuclear plants sold their power into the same wholesale market as everyone else, at an average of around $30 a megawatt hour in 2024. At that price, an aging plant with high fixed costs is running on fumes, which is exactly why more than a dozen U.S. reactors have shut down early since 2013. Plants like Vermont Yankee, Kewaunee in Wisconsin, and Pilgrim in Massachusetts all closed years before their licenses expired because the math simply stopped working. The real money now comes from something almost nobody watching this expected 5 years ago: long-term contracts with technology companies that need electricity running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week forever. to power artificial intelligence data centers. Amazon signed a deal near the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania, tied to a $20 billion data center build-out. Microsoft locked in 3 Mile Island. These companies don't care that solar is cheaper on paper. Solar works about a quarter of the hours in a year. Wind works about a third. A nuclear plant, on average across the whole U.S. industry, runs at 92% of its maximum output, nearly every hour of every day for years at a stretch. If your data center never sleeps, the plant that never sleeps is worth paying triple for. Here's the part that breaks people's brains: the actual uranium you burn to make all of this. Electricity costs almost nothing. Fuel for a nuclear plant, including mining, enriching, and fabricating the uranium into usable rods, runs at roughly 0.6 cents per kilowatt hour. Compare that to a gas station making 3 to 7 cents of profit per gallon, or a refinery living and dying by the spread between crude oil and gasoline. To put 0.6 cents in perspective, the average American household pays somewhere around 13 to 16 cents for that same kilowatt hour on their utility bill. The raw uranium is less than 5% of what you're actually being charged for. A nuclear plant isn't gambling on a commodity price the way an oil business is. The physical fuel is a rounding error. What you're actually selling isn't the electricity itself. It's the guarantee that it will be there unfailingly in 20 years. In a hurricane, in a heat wave, on a Tuesday. You're not in the electricity business, you're in the certainty business. And certainty is what a data center will pay almost any price for. Step back for a second, because this business has a second brain break most people never see coming, and it involves what happens if something goes wrong. No private insurance company will fully cover the cost of a nuclear accident on its own. It's considered too large a risk for any single insurer to hold. So since 1957, federal law has required every nuclear plant in the country to pay into a shared pool with every other reactor operator in America. If one plant has a serious accident, all 94 other operating reactors chip in up to about $165 million each to help cover the damages, on top of the plant's own $500 million private policy. Add it all up, and the entire industry's combined liability for a single accident is capped at roughly $16.6 billion. If the damage costs more than that, and Fukushima alone is estimated to have cost over $100 billion, Congress decides what happens next. You're never insuring your plant alone. You're one member of a 94-reactor insurance company that nobody signed up for by choice, and that only exists because no bank or insurer on Earth would take this risk on their own books. There's a second obligation baked into the deed, and you can't walk away from it either. Every nuclear plant is legally required to set aside money continuously for the day it eventually shuts down into a fund it can't touch for anything else. Decommissioning, tearing down the reactor, safely removing the radioactive material, and returning the site to a usable state typically runs somewhere between $500 million and $1.5 billion per reactor. That money gets collected slowly over decades of operation and locked into a trust because Congress does not want a shut-down reactor sitting there with no one left solvent enough to clean it up. And restarting a dead plant is not the shortcut it looks like on paper. Palisades was supposed to restart in late 2025. As of this year, it's still not running. Inspectors found cracked tubes in the steam generator that needed specialized repair. The company admitted to missing quality assurance paperwork on the reactor. Environmental groups sued the federal government, arguing a plant that has legally begun decommissioning shouldn't be allowed to unretire at all. Every one of those delays costs real money while the plant sits there earning nothing. Buying the shortcut door doesn't mean the door opens on schedule. There's a third path quietly opening up alongside these two doors, and it's worth knowing about even if it isn't fully built yet. Instead of restarting a giant plant or building one from scratch, some companies are trying to build much smaller reactors in the 300 megawatt range instead of 800 or 1,100, assembled largely in a factory and shipped to the site rather than poured in place over a decade. Holtec is already planning 2 of these small modular reactors right next to Palisades, backed by a separate $400 million federal grant. The pitch is a shorter build time and a lower price tag per project. Nobody has finished one in the U.S. yet, which means nobody can prove the economics work outside a spreadsheet. It's the option every utility in the country is watching closely, and none of them are betting the company on just yet. Time to pull it all together and answer the actual question. How much money do you make if you do this right? 2 scenarios, real numbers. Scenario 1, the restart play. You spend $1.6 billion reviving an 835-megawatt reactor, and you land a 20-year contract at $112 a megawatt hour, roughly the 3 Mile Island deal. Running at 92% of capacity, that plant produces about 6.7 million megawatt hours a year. At $112 each, that's just over $750 million in annual revenue. Fuel and operating costs eat up roughly $170 million of that. You're clearing something like $580 million a year before financing costs on a $1.6 billion investment. That's a payback period of under 3 years, which is almost unheard of for a power plant, and it's exactly why Constellation stock jumped 22% in a single day when the Microsoft deal was announced. Scenario 2, building new. You spend $36.8 billion in 15 years constructing 2,200 megawatts of brand new nuclear capacity, Vodal style. Even if you eventually land the same kind of premium contract, running that capacity at 92% gets you about 18 million megawatt hours a year, worth roughly $2 billion at $112 each. Subtract operating costs and you're clearing around $1.5 billion a year. Against a $36.8 billion price tag, that's a payback period of well over 2 decades, on top of the 15 years you already spent building it and earning nothing. Call it 40 years from breaking ground to profit. That is not a business plan, that's a multi-generational bet backed by a government loan guarantee, and it's the reason nobody in America is placing it right now. The gap between those two numbers is the entire nuclear industry in one sentence. The identical physical asset sold on the wrong contract is a business that shuts down and sits dark for 5 years. Sold on the right one. It's the fastest payback in the American electricity business and the reason Wall Street can't stop talking about it. Constellation Energy shares had already more than doubled that year on nothing but the expectation that deals like this were coming, then jumped another 22% in a single day the moment the Microsoft contract actually got signed, on the promise of a single reactor most of the country had already forgotten existed. Sheldon Adelson built a $35 billion fortune off casinos most people can walk into. The people building fortunes off nuclear plants right now are doing it off reactors most people will never see behind a fence line in rural Pennsylvania, and the fuel costs less than a rounding error. You're not paying for the electricity, you're paying for the one thing nothing else on the grid can promise, that the lights stay on no matter what.